Something that is not particularly known in the Lord of the Rings community is that the story and Middle-earth as a whole is actually supposed to be a part of our real-world history. In fact, Tolkien went to such an extent that he made up an entire meta-story with how he ended up with the Lord of the Rings in the first place. According to this story, Tolkien stumbled upon an ancient tome while at Oxford, written entirely in the languages of Middle-earth. This ancient artifact can trace its origins back to the original Red Book of Westmarch that we see in our stories, which was written by Bilbo and Frodo themselves and tells of the events that transpired. Under Tolkien's meta-narrative, he is simply the translator of what ultimately became The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And the Silmarillion was simply the stories of elven history that Bilbo had written down following his time with the elves. This is actually a very common literary device, in which the author inserts his fictional writings into reality, so he wasn't actually delusional. And additionally, when you consider the number of decades that Tolkien dedicated to his writings, it comes as no surprise that this wasn't the original framing of the story. Originally, according to manuscripts that have since been published, the Book of Lost Tales was found at the Isle of Tol Eressëa by a man named Ariel. Tol Eressëa eventually became England, and the rest is history, as they say. Naturally, this eventually changed, but you get the idea that in Tolkien's mind, Arda and Middle-earth were innately connected with our own world within the fictional narrative. He even wrote a time travel story in which a 20th century British child travels back to Númenor in his dreams. And not to mention, he even went through the process of translating each real-life constellation and planet in Middle-earth languages and added their own unique cultural backstories. The question that arises from all of this is why? Why did he go through the effort of explaining his fantastical story through real-life consistency? Why wasn't Arda just Arda and left at that? Why connect it to our own world deliberately? The answer to this question has multiple layers that are each inherently connected to Tolkien's mindset as an author and a person in general. To start with the basics, let us first understand Tolkien first. What Tolkien did with his writings was what he called a subcreation, mythopoeia or myth-making. He adored myths, and so he went on to write his own mythical stories and overarching narratives. When a man writes myths for over 50 years, something happens. He gradually connects them, like he did with the Silmarillion's Arda and the Hobbit. He makes them internally consistent, writes backstories, and provides world building. In his spare time, he may construct entirely new languages and then write poetry. Tolkien's Legendarium was fundamentally not the product of an author who just wanted to be published, though that did come eventually, but rather the product of a hobbyist. That's why there is so much depth. J.R.R. Tolkien spent nearly the entirety of his life doing what he loved, and his Legendarium was the result. The way that he approached it was no different from you or I using our free time to play some sort of sport or a video game. The difference is that he was very good at his hobby, unlike me. So good in fact that he then gained the prospect and will for publication with The Hobbit, and his publisher then requested a sequel in the form of The Lord of the Rings. With all of this said, Tolkien did not see the reason for his writing hobby being some sort of new fantastical Earth or universe. We already have our Earth and universe, so what's the point of making an entirely new one to put his story in? If you think about it, the vast majority of myths and fairy stories before and largely during Tolkien's time always took place in the real world. The man was a medievalist at heart, and the myths of the Middle Ages taking place in some alien fantastical planet was simply unprecedented. Therefore, the default option of choosing our Earth is what Tolkien decided to stay with, not something he chose to go away to. In letter 165, he outright says, "Middle-earth, by the way, is not a name of a never-never land without relation to the world we live in. It is just a use of Middle English Middle-earde, altered from Old English Midgard. the name for the inhabited lands of men between the seas. And though I have not attempted to relate the shape of the mountains and land masses to what geologists may say or surmise about the nearer past, imaginatively, this history is supposed to take place in a period of the actual old world of this planet. In letter 211, he goes into further detail behind his thought process, stating, "May I say that all this is mythical and not any kind of new religion or vision? As far as I know, it is merely an imaginative invention to express, in the only way I can, some of my dim apprehensions of the world. All I can say is that, if it were history, it would be difficult to fit the lands and events, or cultures, into such evidence as we possess, archaeological or geological, concerning the nearer or remoter part of what is now called Europe, though the Shire, for instance, is expressly stated to have been in this region. I could have fitted things in with greater verisimilitude if the story had not become too far developed before the question ever occurred to me. I doubt if there would have been much to gain, and I hope the evidently long but undefined gap in time between the fall of Barad-dûr and our days is sufficient for literary credibility even for readers acquainted with what is known or surmised of prehistory." In the same letter, he continues this sentiment and even acknowledges that a large number of people mistakenly think that Middle-earth is supposed to be an entirely new world and universe, famously mentioning that about 6,000 years have passed since the events of the book. Naturally, this number is not supposed to be taken at face value, as his opinion changed dramatically throughout his writings. In letter 183, Tolkien makes mention of Middle-earth's place in the world yet again, commenting, "I am historically minded. Middle-earth is not an imaginary world. The name is the modern form, appearing in the 30th century and still in use, of Midden-earth, an ancient name for the Ikoumeni, the abiding place of men, the objectively real world, in use specifically opposed to imaginary worlds, as fairyland, or unseen worlds, as heaven or hell. The theater of my tale is this earth, the one in which we now live, but the historical period is imaginary. The essentials of that abiding place are all there, at any rate for inhabitants of Northwest Europe, so naturally it feels familiar, even if a little glorified by the enchantment of distance in time." Keeping in mind what Arda meant to Tolkien as a mythmaker and medievalist, as something he enjoyed doing, it also makes sense that he would enjoy making historical and geographical connections to his myths, or the meta-narrative that we mentioned in the beginning of the video, or just taking the role of the forgotten language translator. These things just added an extra layer of authenticity and, frankly, fun to his world. Another reason that he may have felt that the real world was more fitting for his story may have been Eru Ilúvatar, or God. The place of God in The Lord of the Rings has been detailed in this channel before, but the main thing to take away is that he exists and has a place in the story. Even more so in the themes of the story, primarily life and death, according to Tolkien himself. Would the story taking place in a fictional planet involve the creation of an entirely fictional god? Would there be no god at all? All of these are things you simply don't have to worry about if the story takes place in our world, but at a time you can just refer to as mythical and call it a day. Ultimately, the final answer is this. Because Tolkien was who he just saw it as unnecessary for his stories to take place in an unfamiliar earth. This was simply not the tradition of the Middle Ages and of the myths he loved. This was then compounded by his enjoyment in creating stories that connected our times. He liked writing as a translator and essentially acting like an archaeologist of sorts, and he loved making little connections like that of the stars or the general geography of the world. This idea then grew and became more important as both the content and the fame of his legendarium grew, leading to what we have today. And, before the end of the video, Tolkien's friend C.S. Lewis was so into this Middle-earth in real-life idea that the Legend of Númenor took place before the events of his space trilogy, writing in the prelude that Those who would like to learn further about Númenor and the True West must, alas, await the publication of much that still exists only in the manuscripts of my friend, Professor J.R.R. Tolkien. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.